Welcome to the 2020-2021 Shafter cover crop trial. The goal of this trial was to see which cover crop species do the best in this area of California. I planted 5 cover crop mixes at the Shafter Research Farm in Kern County. I used a cone seeder to plant the mixes on November 5th, 2020. I planted at 1.8 times the recommended seeding rate. I wanted to see how much water these different mixes need, so I grouped each mix under irrigated and non-irrigated scenarios. The non-irrigated plots received 2.7 inches of total water, and the irrigated plots received 4.8 inches of total water. I'll start with the soil builder mix. It contains yellow mustard, Dundale peas, common vetch, triticale, and radish. Here's what the irrigated plot looked like in mid-March. It was about 5.5 feet tall. Here are the species that we saw in the irrigated plots. Even though the seeds in the mix were only 15% brassica, the brassicas totally dominated this mix. The peas and vetch made a very small contribution. Here's a non-irrigated plot. It's only about 2.5 feet tall. Here are the species that we saw in the non-irrigated plots. The brassicas dominated the mix, and the triticale did okay. The vetch and peas didn't even show up. Next, I'll discuss the soil health mix. This mix contains Merced rye, berseem clover, common vetch, white mustard, and radish. Here's a picture of an irrigated soil health plot in mid-March. It's about 6 feet tall. Here are the species that we saw in that plot. The rye and brassicas totally dominated, even though the seed mix was 50% clover and vetch. Here's a non-irrigated plot. It's about 3.5 feet tall. As you can see, the brassicas and rye did okay, but the vetch and clover didn't even show up. Next, I'll discuss the barley and vetch mix. This contains barley and common vetch. Here's a picture of an irrigated plot in March. It's about 3.5 feet tall. These are the species that we saw in that plot. The barley totally dominated, even though the seed mix was 30% vetch. Here's a non-irrigated plot. It's 1.5 feet tall and has been munched on by rabbits. In the non-irrigated plot, the barley did okay. The vetch barely showed up. Next, I'll discuss the rye and pea mix. This contains Merced rye and Dundale peas. Here's an irrigated plot in March. It's 5.5 feet tall. These are the species from that plot. The rye totally dominated. Even though the seed mix was 60% pea, we didn't see that much of it. Here's a non-irrigated plot in March. It's 3.5 feet tall. In the non-irrigated plot, the rye did quite well, while the peas barely even showed up. Finally, I'll talk about the brassica pollinator mix. It contains white, Nemphix, and yellow mustards, along with canola and radish. Here's an irrigated plot in March. It's 6 feet tall. We didn't separate the species for this mix because they look so similar to one another. In contrast, the non-irrigated plot is 3.5 feet tall, but it still has plenty of flowers. In all of the mixes, the grasses and brassicas did better than the legumes. This is because there were plenty of nutrients in the soil. I didn't irrigate very much, and this winter was also pretty warm. These are good growing conditions for brassicas and grasses. If there had been less nitrogen and more water, the legumes might have done better. We measured above-ground biomass on March 17, 2021. The mixes all produced similar amounts of biomass after receiving 4.8 inches of water. This also occurred for the non-irrigated plots. The mixes all produced similar amounts of biomass after receiving 2.7 inches of water. All of the non-irrigated plots contributed some amount of biomass. This means that even if you cannot irrigate your cover crops, you can still reap some soil health benefits. All of the mixes provided excellent weed suppression. This is because I pre-irrigated and disked the field before planting. I also planted in early November when it was still warm, so the cover crops grew quickly. Finally, I seeded at 1.8 times the recommended rate. We measured the soil nitrate at 0 to 6 inches before planting and after terminating the cover crops. Here's what we saw. The fallow plots in late April had the same amount of nitrate as the field had in October before planting. The two mixes that were dominated by brassicas had very similar amounts of soil nitrate to the fallow. The mix that was half brassica and half grass had less soil nitrate, and the mixes that were dominated by grasses had the least amount of soil nitrate. This happened because brassicas have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, so soil microbes can quickly break down the plant tissue and those nutrients will be available to the next crop. Grasses have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio in their plant tissue. This forced the soil microbes to go scavenging for nitrate in the soil. So, which cover crops should you plant? It depends on your goals. If you want to provide forage for bees, we saw a lot of bees on the mustard, canola, and radish flowers. If you want to have lots of nitrate for your annual cash crop, then you can plant cover crops with a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, like brassicas or legumes. However, if you have too much nitrate in the soil, it can leach into the groundwater, which pollutes drinking water and is a waste of money. Planting a grass cover crop with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio can temporarily reduce nitrate in the soil, which will reduce leaching into groundwater. A big thank you to all of the people listed here. For more information about cover crops, check out the links in the video description.